This is getting kind of old, but yeah, what if there's sin? So the picture is very clear, is that we know you're a God of mercy. If there's any reason, if there's anything here to show mercy on, we know that you'll do it. So this whole notion that God called about the unwarranted destruction of every creature that was in a particular place at a particular time, I think that's a little bit overblown. Now we come to the next one, slavery. In the Old Testament, there's all kinds of rules and regulations and conversations about slavery. It's the skeptic or the doubter or even the Christian who doesn't have much of an appreciation for what's really happening might come away with the impression that, well, this is just another example of an Old Testament God versus a New Testament God. Well, there's no such thing as an Old Testament God and a New Testament God. There's God. So we need to make some sense of what was happening at this time and why it was happening, and why we should be very careful about going too far with the accusations against God that we often hear, particularly from the skeptics. So if you're thinking about, if you just had to make a list of the worst things that have probably happened in history, you're going to have a hard time not putting the Holocaust at number 1 or 1A or somewhere. It was one of the problems with the Holocaust was after thousands of years of civilization, supposedly human progress, where we have advanced as societies. Well, one of the most advanced societies at the time of the Holocaust, that is Germany, decided that what it would do is not only enslave people, capture them as political prisoners, prisoners of war, but would then just routinely execute them. Now, we hear about the Jews, as well we should. There were approximately 6 million Jews that were killed in the Holocaust. Approximately 5.7 million Soviet civilians. 5.7. Soviet POWs, about 3 million. Poles, anywhere from 2 to 3 million. Serbs, anywhere from 3 to 800,000. Disabled people, 275,000. Romanians, upwards to 500,000. Freemasons, upwards to 200,000. Slovenians, 25,000. Homosexuals, 15,000. Spanish Republicans, about 3,500. And then finally, Jehovah's Witnesses, maybe about 5,000. Now, some people don't realize Hitler actually came out with a racial pecking order. And in his view, the lowest of the low were the Jews. He took the blacks, the Negroes, the African Americans, whatever the terminology at his time would have been, the Negroes, and he put them slightly above. And he had the Poles and the Romanians, and all of these, and of course, and then you finally worked your way up to who? The Aryans. Well, you can imagine Hitler's displeasure is sitting here watching a black man from America who is supposed to be, while his Aryan superior race, which was up here, get humiliated by this guy's 4 gold medals. Mr. Jesse Owens probably did more singly to demolish Hitler's master race than probably any single human being. But this was 20 million people. But this happened over a very short period of time. And so that one's horrific. But now let's talk a little bit about slavery, because slavery needs to take into account longevity, and it needs to take into account universality. Between the two, neither one of these need to really go in the Hall of Fame for human accomplishments. That one we can be sure of. So, quick question. When was slavery, what was the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery? Brazil. 1877. The Civil War had already been fought. 12 years later, Brazil finally joins the club and says, we will denounce slavery, which supposedly eradicates slavery from the Western Hemisphere, right? Well, now we've got something called sex trafficking, because we don't want to call it what? Slavery. A movie comes out that suggests that the enslavement of children is epidemic. Some people oppose the movie vehemently because they claim that it contains QAnon conspiracy theories, which is kind of hard to really wrap your head around. These are two different issues altogether. Now, when someone comes up to me and says there are tunnels in Washington, D.C. and New York where babies are bred for the sole purpose of getting their blood and performing sex rituals and stuff, I'm kind of like, I'm going to pass on that. You're going to have to tell me how you keep these kids fed. You're going to have to tell me how you keep the sewage from turning it into a rampant epidemic. I mean, it's just kind of hard to envision. That to me is a QAnon theory, right? And I'm not going down that road. You have a hard time convincing me that what we know about the sex slave thing has anything to do with any kind of theory like that. This is not the same kind of deal. There are people who will take kids and they will do with them whatever, and we know this from just the immigration problem we've got at the southern border, where kids are being sent on their own, or they're being used in the most horrible ways. So we're talking slavery. We'll get to the Old Testament, but we need to know this. Here's the interesting thing, because what often happens with evil is when one evil goes away, another evil kind of sucks its way in, kind of fills the void. Everybody thought when we got bin Laden, we got it. Well, what happened? There's another bin Laden. There's another. There's always some evil that's willing to step in where evil was. So in 1877, Brazil stops endorsing slavery as an official part of their culture and law. So we think that we''t kind of erased in the civilized world slavery. But what happens 40 years later in Russia? A revolution. What did the revolution do? It enslaved millions and killed millions. We just renamed it. Now we don't call it slavery. Now we call it the Bolshevik Revolution. But the Bolshevik Revolution winds up with untold tombs, or not even tombs, untold death tolls that rival the Holocaust. We haven't even gotten to Stalin, who was a professional murderer by all accounts. And all of these glorious pictures of, we're going to give you freedom, we're going to give you this, we're going to give you that, we're going to create this utopia. Well, what it created was killing fields in Cambodia, because the dictator there decides that certain people just simply can't live anymore. Hitler, it creates that. Mao starved probably 40 million of his people to death. 40 million. So slavery doesn't necessarily have to be the kind of slavery that we think about, which is the Southern American slavery. We're going to talk about that one briefly before we get into it. So, this is what we need to know. Throughout history, we got it in the Old Testament, which is some of the most ancient writings that we have. Throughout history, human beings have enslaved other human beings. It's who we are. You may not like it, shouldn't like it, but it's in our legacy, and it is undeniable. In most cases, in many, if not most, at least in many, but probably in most, the enslavement was people of their own race. It wasn't cross-cultural or cross-racial. That would be true of Europeans, that would be true of Asians, that would be true of Africans, and that would be true of people that were in the Western Hemisphere long before Columbus ever appeared. Slavery was a fact of life across cultures, across beliefs. It even gets so bad that you can look in Buddhist and Christian monasteries. At one time, both had slaves. This is where it's at, I guess. It's unfortunate. Europeans enslaved other Europeans for centuries before any European bought the first African slave. Most African slaves were purchased from other Africans who had enslaved them themselves. Europeans were also enslaved by non-Europeans. It's not a well-known, it's not very well discussed, but it is a known fact. Barbary Coast pirates actually captured more Europeans and enslaved those Europeans than the African slaves who were brought to the United States and the American colonies that preceded the nation's birth. Does that excuse that? Absolutely not. But he points out that it's a systemic problem. It's not an American problem. It's America's part was part of the problem. Europe, the raids were so frequent that they built watchtowers on the coast. Because if they saw the pirate ships approaching, they would warn the residents near the coastline, get out of town. They're about to come try and enslave a bunch of people. So they would take off. On the island of Sicily, there's over 100 watchtowers alone. Over 100. So this whole notion that slavery was a unique practice of America, then if you think that, you miss the breadth and the scope of the horrible practice that it was. You assign it a role in history that it really cannot stand the scrutiny. When you see the act of slavery, where I think I can simply take you and use you as property, it is without a doubt one of the biggest stains on the soul of humanity, if you will. So here's what we know. This goes back into ancient times. Slavery, as we've just seen, it's not unique to a race, it's not unique to a country, it's not unique to a time period. What's one of the interesting things about Israel? It was what? Enslaved. For quite a number of years, they were victims of enslavement. And yet we're going to see today briefly that they were also instructed how to deal with their own slaves. Now, part of what this tells us is, it tells us something about God, but it tells us more about man. It tells us that in the world we live in, a lot of times the things that man does or can do is depraved. If you've ever read Frederick Douglass's description of his slave master, if you haven't, you should, because he just describes him as a most cruel man. Douglass has such a eloquent way with words, but he would recall this aunt that he had, and he would just Douglass's master would just whip her for no reason, just with no regret and with no restraint. And he just says he was just a vicious man. Now, interestingly, Douglass was given as property to a kinsman of this original guy. Douglass and this, I believe it was AULD or AULT. I think it was old, AULD. But Douglass and this person who had been his slave owner met later in Douglass's life, and they reconciled. And Douglas describes it as there was just tears between both of them, reconciliation. And the one guy just apologizing for, if I'd have been you, Frederick, I would have run away. And there was this need for Douglas to be able to put some of this to bed. And Douglas even told him, he said, you know, I have to turn. I had accused you of doing some things you hadn't done. It's a fascinating read. Doesn't take long. But back to Israel. They've been enslaved. And if you read through the Old Testament, there is just all kinds of conversations about slavery. We're not going to try and get into all of them. Some of them have details that you could take 2 sermons on. But the general point that we want to make here is that God never intended anyone to be enslaved. That's the central point. We're going to see that in Scripture. We also know that the economic reality of ancient Israel was poverty, hand-to-mouth poverty. What happened when you harvested your field? What were you supposed to do? You leave a portion. Why did you do that? Not for the birds. You left that for the poor people to come gather their scraps because they had no means of support. Every 7th year, what did you do? Turned and forgave the debts. And every 50th year was a jubilee where this whole thing was just a complete refreshing and a reset. But every 7th year, if the servant could work their way free through a 7-year process. So the economic reality was such that you got to do something with these people. Now, I can use an example today that's very close. What do you do with the people coming across the border? What do you do? I mean, you could say, well, the Christian obligation is to reach out. Yes. And you could say that many of these people are coming here for a better. Yes, they are. But I can also rightfully point out some of these people they're not good people. They're sex trade. They're drug trade. They're here to do harm. And so if you don't have some kind of process in place, what happens? Well, it turns into, when do we lose control? Now, interestingly, and I'm not trying to get into politics here, but I do like logic always kinds of interests me. For some of the people who would say that, well, the open borders are a good thing, then I would suggest you the next time you go fly, just tell those TSA people, don't worry about checking any of these people. Just let them on the plane. They all got great intentions. They're all here for a good reason. Now, I don't think they're going to do that. Because when it becomes when we're personally impacted by the results of the consequences of somebody else's actions, we tend to start thinking in self-interest. When New York, which calls itself a sanctuary city, has to go cannibalize all of its soccer fields in order to put up homeless camps, then all of a sudden the mayor of New York starts saying, we can't do this. But you could do this. You were calling yourself a sanctuary city that welcomes everybody. Until what? Until everybody came. And now it's like, whoa, that just called my hand. Well, this is, again, not a political statement, but what it is it's a realization that in our world, there are certain things that are going to happen that have to happen. If you live in an extremely poor place, but it's also a military place where X attacked Y, Y attacked X, everybody just kind of got out. And if you take a city, what do you do with these people? Well, y'all just here. Yeah, I know you're a non-registered alien. Just come vote in our elections. And most Americans do what? No, that can't work. That you've got to have structure here. Well, they were trying to build structure in their time as well. Not that it was the best solution, not that it was the final solution. It was just a reality of that time and that place. So hand-to-mouth subsistence was the order of the day for a lot of Israelites. And what did you do if you were like that? You sold yourself into service. Tommy, I'm broke. I'm dead broke. I'll work for you for 7 years if you'll let me do that. Now that's different from saying I just went and ripped Tommy out of his house and said, you're going to work for me. This would be indentured servanthood. In fact, we're going to see in just a second, kidnapping someone and using them for those kind of purposes was punishable by death. So this is what it says. Deuteronomy 15. This was the ultimate goal, is to eliminate the poor in Israel. You don't have to look it up. Just you want to just jot it, because these are the crucial. If you want to, that's fine too. At the end of every 7 years, cancel debts. Not you should, you must. This is how it is to be done. There's no discussion here. Every creditor shall cancel any loan they have made to a fellow Israelite. Now, Aiden, being who he is, when do you think he went and made the loan? He goes, 6th year. I bet your interest, well, you couldn't charge interest, right? Because you were an Israelite. Right. So you got to be savvy about this stuff. It might be you were having a hard time getting your money at that point, but you get my point. This says there is no equivocation on this. Every 7th year, cancel the debt, cancel the loan. Cancel any loan that's been made to a fellow Israelite. Do not require payment from anyone among their own people, because the Lord's time for canceling debts has been proclaimed. You may require payments from a foreigner, but you must cancel any debts your fellow Israelites owe you. Verse 4, this is important. This is the key verse. However, there need be no poor people among you, for in the land the Lord your God is giving you to possess as your inheritance, he will richly bless you. So what he's saying is that if you'll just depend on me and cancel these people, trust me, you'll be okay. If only you fully obey the Lord your God and are careful to follow all these commands I give you, for the Lord your God will bless you as he has promised, and you will lend to many nations, but you will borrow from none. I wonder if that's where Ben Franklin got his little ditty. You will rule over many nations, but none will rule over you. If anyone is poor among your fellow Israelites in any of the towns the Lord gave you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted. Rather be open-handed and freely lend them whatever they need. Be careful not to harbor this wicked thought. The 7th year, the year for canceling debts, is near, so that you do not show ill will towards the needy among your fellow Israelites and give them nothing. Oh, he just explained, didn't he, Aiden? Yes, he did. And he also tells the people, if you go ask, it better be a sincere ask. You can't just show up and just begging for this stuff. But when you're giving this money, don't you be looking at your calendar and going, oh, wow. They may then appeal to the Lord against you, and you will be found guilty of sin. Give generously to them and do so without a grudging heart. Because of this, the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and everything you put your hand to. Therefore, I command you to be open-handed towards your fellow Israelites who are poor and needy in your land. That's pretty clear. So the indentured servant could be set free. The indentured servant did this voluntarily. Exodus 21 explains it a little more. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he's to serve you for 6 years. In the 7th year, he shall go free without paying anything, because he's worked for you. If he comes alone, he goes free alone. If he has a wife when he comes, she can go with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the women and her children shall belong to her master, and only the man shall go free. But if the servant declares, I love my master and my wife and my children, I don't want to go free, then his master must take him before the judges. He shall take him to the door of the doorpost and pierce his ear with an awl. Then he will be a servant for life. If a man sells his daughter as a servant, she's not to go free as male servants. If she does not please the master who selected her, he must let her be redeemed. He has no right to sell her to foreigners, because he has broken faith with her. If he selects her for a son, he must grant her the rights of a daughter. So although these things sound rather ancient to us, they still provide, if you compare them to the rest of the world that this was in, much more compassionate, and they're being led towards, God says the ideal is, if you'll just trust me, none of these people need to be poor. And it even says that some servants could prefer to stay. They had the option. or they could leave. If any of your people, this is in Deuteronomy as well, verse 12, if any of your people, men or women, sell themselves to you and serve you 6 years, 7th year, let them go. When you release them, don't let them go empty-handed. Give them liberally from your flock, your threshing floor, and your wine. Give to them as the Lord your God has blessed you. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. That's why I give you this command. This kind of sounds like do unto others. That's sort of being summarized. But if your servant says, I don't want to leave you because he loves you and your family is well off, take it all, push it through his earlobe, and he will become your servant for life. Do the same for your female. Do not consider it a hardship to set your servant free, because their service to you for those 6 years was worth twice as much as that of a hired hand. And then, well, what about the foreigner? So this is how the Israelites treated their own. Well, generally, the foreigners got fewer benefits. They were usually captured from wars. And it says that when, this is in Exodus, when you march up to attack a city, make its people an offer of peace. If they accept and open their gates, all the people in it shall be subject to forced labor. Make an offer of peace. If they accept and open their gates, shall be subject. But it says this in Exodus, anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession. This is obviously about slavery. If you were a foreigner, you were given privileges, but again, not on the same order. This is what it says in Exodus again, 21. If an Israelite marries another woman, and this is speaking about a woman who is not an Israelite, the first woman that he's married, so he's married a foreigner, he must not deprive the first one of her food, clothing, and marital rights. If he does not provide her with those three things, she is to go free without any payment of money. So if he doesn't fulfill his end of the deal, she can go. And then it says this in Leviticus. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. You can buy slaves from them. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clan, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property, and you can make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. If a foreigner among you becomes rich and any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to the foreigner or to a member of the foreigner's clan, they still have the right of redemption after they sold themselves. One of their relatives may redeem them. And then it says this about slaves that run away. If a slave has taken refuge with you, do not hand them over to their master. Let them live among you wherever they like and in whatever town they choose. Do not oppress them. So if a person says, I'm not living with you anymore, I'm going to find someone else, everybody became a sanctuary. These were sanctuary opportunities. But the expectation was, and it was very clear, if you're doing this, you're going to have to abide by the way we're doing this. Which is where I think today's world, we don't really have the expectation of what's going to happen to these people coming in. We haven't solved that problem. And in many cases, what they're doing is just morphing into the communities and cultures without really having any way to identify whether they're being productive, whether they actually belong here, whether they're draining the system. There's a multitude of issues there.
What part of Leviticus was it that you quoted?
That was 25, I believe. 25, yeah. Yes.
20 what?
25. 25.
Thank you.
So what can we tell from all this? Okay, well, two things. We can tell the Israelites were treated a little differently from the foreigners. That we can tell. We also know that poverty was a reality. And God, in the middle of this, was trying to take what was an economic and social reality and try to make it to a point where it provided some level of organization we could say the same issue is taking place right now at the border. Foreigners entered Israel through business transactions or through conquest. Sometimes they were there to make money. Sometimes they were there because they just got whooped. Those people couldn't be kidnapped. They did provide a source of manpower, and manpower was one of the things, that was really your only thing you could barter at that time. If you didn't have money, you had yourself. And this notion of they couldn't be kidnapped, they could, if they were not treated well, they could leave and go to refuge with someone else. That was just not found in the surrounding cultures. Israel was treating its people in a far better way than what was happening in those places. And as we said, if you take a person today, comes across the border, and you say, well, I'm going to give them full voting rights and make them a full citizen without any kind of process, the Israelites would have looked at you and said, well, no, we can't do that. That'll create chaos. And I think that's what most places have said, and that's what we're seeing today, is that a mayor of a place who said, this is something that should absolutely take place, until it starts happening to the point where I can't handle it. Well, we got to do something about this now. So, although the institution that was being used was certainly not something that God thought was appropriate, it was something that was necessary given those particular times. The people in Israel were in a brand new country. They had just got there. It was called the Promised Land. There was opportunities, but they weren't unbridled. But even the people who were enslaved could gain enough means to free themselves, and they could even acquire Israeli servants if they were foreigners. And this is not an apologetic for slavery. It has to be one of the biggest stains on human history that we have. But it is, I think, somewhat of an explanation of what had to happen given the particular circumstances at that time. Another thing they had talked about was, are they going to shoot down another plane on 9/11? You could have been completely innocent on that plane, but there could have been terrorists on that plane, let's say, that were going to try and hit the U.S. Capitol. And the decision had been made to do what? If there's any more out there, they're coming down. Now, that's not an endorsement of murder. That's a recognition that we've got a problem here, that the only way we can solve it right now is through these means. Maybe not the best analogy, but that's kind of where Israel found itself. We got to do something. If we don't, these are people that we've either conquered, or these are people who do not follow our laws. We have to have some means of dealing with this. It's hardly the notion that God thought this was a great idea, as he already explained in Deuteronomy, where he said, if you do this right, you won't even have the poor among you. So, even though it was happening, it was not the ideal situation, just like shooting down an airplane wouldn't be the ideal situation. You're just left with limited options. God's preference was never slavery, but God's preference wasn't the Holocaust either, nor was it the killing fields, nor was it a Marxist regime that Lenin, Pol Pot, Stalin, and Mao created. God does not prefer slavery. In fact, God dealt with slavery to sin, by actually taking a cross and letting it be the substitute penalty. In 1955, a lady named Jill Jackson wrote a song that we hear a lot of times at Christmas time, "Let There Be Peace on Earth." She wrote the song after a failed suicide attempt. She said, I realized at that point I had almost like a Paul's trip to Damascus. I had a profound experience. And in some ways she had been enslaved, if you will. Suicide is the ultimate enslavement, because you've been trapped by yourself. You have decided there is no way out. And that, of course, is never the case. But she survived, and she wrote these words. As a result, she said, feeling loved after that. Let there be peace on earth, and let it begin with me. Well, if we simply, that's what Deuteronomy said. If you do what I ask you to do, there will be no poor among you, because I will bless your land. And that was a theocracy. I'm not trying to extend that to the world today, but God was saying, you do what you're supposed to do, and I'll take care of the rest. Let there be peace on earth, and let it begin with me. How many people are enslaved because of the fact that they can't, those two little verses are never met? Let there be peace on earth, the peace that was meant to be. With God as our Father, brothers all are we. Let me walk with my brother in perfect harmony. No slavery. My brother. Let peace begin with me. Let this be the moment now. With every step I take, let this be my solemn vow. To take each moment and live each moment in peace eternally. Let there be peace on earth, and let it begin with me. Slavery is perhaps one of the most shocking examples of no peace. There is no peace. But yet in the middle of that, we see examples of slavery where it says, if the master and the servant love each other so much, then it's okay for that relationship to continue. And so even in the middle of a very bad situation, Paul goes even further. He says, when he talks about masters and slaves in the New Testament, he talks about the way that they treat each other is basically no different. The master treats the slave the same way as the slave treats the master. Very, very profound progression of the expectations over time. We're supposed to be getting better. It's called sanctification. But the world is not sanctifying. The world is desanctifying right now. We trade 5-year-old kids for sex objects. We have unspeakable horrors going on. We have families that are supposedly foster care for children and abusing them horrifically. I mean, it's everywhere. So, as you read, or even as what most people do is just simply ignore, when you read the Old Testament about slavery and stuff, keep in mind this was never the plan, and it was forced upon a country based upon the economic and social realities of that time. Sometimes it's the only way to survive. It's not ideal. It's just simply necessary. So we're going to finish this up with two things. First of all, we're going to look at how Jesus is the total fulfillment of the Old Testament. That's where we need to really understand that. And then in line with that, we're also going to look at, if he is the fulfillment of the Old Testament, is there such thing as having a moral anchor without a moral anchor bearer? Is there such thing as good and bad? If there is, how do we interpret that? We'll take both of those and come out of this little series, and then we're going to go into Daniel, where Daniel was enslaved, and how he took that enslavement and turned it into something that glorified and honored God. So, as we move forward into this, that just kind of gives you an idea of where we're going to try and go. I look forward to it. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. So, Father, we ask that you give us some wisdom as we read some of these difficult verses and chapters, and that we recognize that these things are not joyfully part of your nature. They just simply recognize these are the things that had to be done at the times they were done. And in relationship to the countries that were around, provided much more compassion than could be found in other places. Not ideal, but moving in the right direction. We are not ideal either, and hopefully we are moving in the right direction. be with us. Help us to do that. Help us to be part of your broad plan to release people from the slavery of sin. My chains are gone. I've been set free. My God, my Savior has rescued me. I think we're going to sing that. Because the biggest enslavement of all is when you've been enslaved by sin, which simply means you're separated from the one who loves you more than you can love yourself. Now, when you think about that, that's pretty profound. So we thank you for that kind of love, and we ask that our actions and deeds honor you and the sacrifices that have been provided for us. It's in your Son's name we